So with Cassandra Nova appearing in Deadpool and Wolverine, I figured now was a great time to make a video explaining the comic book history of her character and turning you guys into experts. So Cassandra Nova first appeared in Marvel Comics with New X-Men issue number 114 back in 2001 by writer Grant Morrison and Frank Quietly. But what's interesting here is she doesn't actually get an origin until New X-Men issues 121 through 125. 125 really focuses a lot on the nature of her character. 121 focuses on how it is she came into existence in the first place. But between these two comic books, what you learn is that Cassandra Nova is what's called a Mumadry, basically the anti-self. And what this meant, as far as Grant Morrison was depicting it, is that in the womb, we all have these kind of internal struggles for the person that we're going to become, almost as if our very nature as human beings is preordained before our birth, and that the person that we become is determined by whichever part of ourselves wins this battle, the darker side or the lighter side. Now, it's not really based on simple terms like good and evil, it's just what we're capable of. The difference here, and the reason why you don't see like an evil version of Cyclops, an evil version of Jean Grey or Wolverine kind of running around out there, is because given how powerful Xavier was and the level of telepathy that he had, he inadvertently created his second self. It was not really intentional, and that second self came in the form of Cassandra Nova. Now, initially, when Xavier in the womb realized what Cassandra Nova was, one, by way of examining her nature, and two, when she tried to kill him in the womb, that he in turn killed her and destroyed that anti-self. It turns out she didn't actually die, and because of the level of power that she had, she gave herself a physical body and then was born into the real world. And then for a number of years, she just stayed hidden. Nobody really knew anything about her, didn't even know that she existed. Even Xavier didn't know that she existed. But all this came to a head in New X-Men issue number 114 with the start of a story called E is for Extinction. Now, for a lot of you guys who watched X-Men 97, this is going to be very, very familiar to you, but E is for Extinction is what the episode Remember It was based on, the attack on Genosha. And because Cassandra Nova had adopted this mentality that mutants as a whole were a race that needed to be wiped out, and seeing herself as something beyond mutants, she had enlisted a guy by the name of Donald Trask III. The reason why was because Donald Trask was the cousin of Bolivar Trask, Bolivar Trask being the one who originally created the Sentinels. But what Bolivar Trask had done in the early days of developing Sentinels is he had developed them in two different forms. The first is the one that you guys are all familiar with, which is the giant robots running around attacking things. He, of course, also created a master mold, which is a giant Sentinel that makes smaller Sentinels. What he had secretly done is he had created wild Sentinels. And unlike normal Sentinels that are built in a lab somewhere or inside a giant master mold, wild Sentinels are technically built in a wild Sentinel master mold. The difference is that they can adapt any and all forms of technology around them and use that to bolster their power. What had happened in this story is that Cassandra Nova used the wild Sentinels and launched an attack on Genosha. And within the span of a few hours, the entire population of Genosha, amounting to around 16 million mutants, were eradicated. There were only a handful of survivors left, meaning you could count that number on one hand. It was nuts. Kind of a side thing that came out of this is Grant Morrison introduced secondary mutations. It's where the mutant Emma Frost got her diamond form from. Now, as crazy as this may have seemed, this was just the opening salvo in a multi-pronged attack to basically destroy the entirety of the mutant population, but specifically the X-Men and all of their close allies. And so at the end of E is for Extinction in issue number 117, Cassandra Nova was basically taken by Wolverine, who had severed her vocal cords, and then she was held prisoner by the X-Men. The issue here is that Cassandra Nova eventually made her way to Cerebra, which was the updated version of Cerebro, the device that Xavier used to scan mutants across the world. And while the intention was to use Cerebra and its ability to amplify her powers to destroy the X-Men, Emma Frost basically neutralized Cassandra Nova by snapping her neck. But what Cassandra did is she took the mind of Xavier and switched it with her own body. So she was in Xavier's body and Xavier's mind was in her body. And because her body was neutralized and nobody realized this had happened, it allowed Cassandra Nova to operate as Xavier with impunity. And so the first thing she does in New X-Men issue number 122 is she exposes Xavier as a mutant to the world and basically does a tell-all with regards to the mutant population. Following that, she takes off into Shi'ar space and then uses her powers to start neutralizing the Shi'ar Empire, which on a galactic scale is a big to-do because the Shi'ar Empire is one of the 3 massive empires that exist out there alongside the Skrull and the Kree. You could argue the Badoon, but that's outside the scope of this conversation. In issue number 126, Cassandra Nova was, by all standards of measurement, defeated, and I imagine on some level with regards to Grant Morrison's run, this was supposed to be the ending of her story, although the effects were pretty massive, and we'll talk about why here in a second. But Cassandra Nova basically makes her way back to Earth again and then intends to access Cerebra a second time. The problem is that the X-Men had figured out what she had done. They had removed Xavier's consciousness from Cassandra's body and then put it in Cerebra, so that when Cassandra Nova entered into Cerebra, she was met with Charles Xavier. And what followed was just kind of a giant astral battle between these two characters. And it was the first time that you really started to understand how powerful Cassandra Nova was on a psychic level. The fact that she was, quite literally, the most significant, clear and present danger to not just the mutant population, but humanity as a whole since Onslaught in the mid-1990s. Now, ultimately, Cassandra Nova is overcome, she's basically defeated, and her mind is thrown back into her body, which it actually turns out is not her body, that it's the body of a shapeshifter. But essentially, it locks her inside that mind. She has no means of escape, and she's quote-unquote reconditioned. But the reason why this was so significant is because it was kind of Grant Morrison building on the ideas of what would happen if Xavier became a bad guy, which is really what the Onslaught saga was based on. And he did this to kind of show how dangerous Xavier could be if he went down the wrong path. Of course, again, it also highlighted the idea that we all kind of have this evil, darker self, but unlike Xavier and Cassandra Nova, it never really manifests in a physical form. Instead, it's just this ongoing battle that we always have taking place between our positive side and our darker side. So again, a lot of meta commentary that went into this story. Now, the other reason why I say this is likely where the story was supposed to end for Cassandra Nova is because following this for a number of years in Marvel Comics, when I say a number, I mean like over a decade, Cassandra Nova didn't really appear. Instead, her actually escaping and going back into the world again didn't come until Astonishing X-Men Volume 3 with issue number 13. Now, that comic was written by Joss Whedon, and Astonishing X-Men is significant for a couple different reasons. One, because it was the return of Colossus after his death at the end of the 1990s, and Marvel basically wrapping up the Legacy Virus storyline. If you don't know what that means, it's not overly important. But Astonishing X-Men was also important because it introduced SWORD and Abigail Brand, basically this organization that monitors extraterrestrial threats, where S.H.I.E.L.D. monitors threats on Earth. But with regards to Cassandra Nova, her reemergence in Marvel Comics came in this story by way of her manipulating the mind of Emma Frost. Now again, this is one of those small moments that's easy to overlook, but it showed how powerful Cassandra was. That despite only being an essence that was just locked in a box somewhere where she literally couldn't access the outside world, she was able to use her powers to subtly influence the mind of Emma Frost and tricked Emma into believing that she had never been loyal to the X-Men. And the only reason why she was on the X-Men team was to basically free Cassandra Nova. And in fact, this happened in a variety of ways. One of the things that takes place is Cassandra Nova's telepathic projections trick Emma into thinking that her secondary mutation of turning into Diamond was an idea that was concocted by herself and Cassandra Nova. The second thing that Cassandra did is she basically fabricated a new version of the Hellfire Club with Sebastian Shaw, Negasonic Teenage Warhead, and others. Now, the reason why this ruse worked so successfully when it came to the Hellfire Club is because it basically involved a little bit of Emma's own history. The most convincing lie that you can tell is a lie that involves a little bit of truth. When it came to Emma Frost as a character, long before she joined the X-Men, she was part of the Hellfire Club, and that was basically an organization that influenced the world behind the scenes. Of course, she had her own team called the Hellions, and they were essentially obliterated. She ultimately turns over a new leaf, joins the X-Men, and then takes over leadership of a team called Generation X. But because of the fact that you had characters like Negasonic Teenage Warhead, all these things came together to basically pull Emma in to this absolute reality that didn't exist. Now, the reason why I also invoke Negasonic Teenage Warhead is because that built on Cassandra Nova's actions in Genosha. Negasonic Teenage Warhead was one of the mutants that was killed in the Genoshan attack, but when Emma Frost emerged from the rubble, she was holding the body of Negasonic Teenage Warhead. And this was important because it was a tangible representation of the fact that Emma couldn't save everybody. So it had very much a lot of guilt that was built into this. And so because this hypnotic suggestion was so strong, albeit a complete and total fabricated mental projection, meaning the Hellfire Club was never over there, none of that stuff. That what Emma Frost did under the control of Cassandra Nova is she launched an attack against the X-Men. And while it wasn't designed to destroy the team, it was designed to make a lot of noise over here so nobody looks at what's happening over there. And what was happening over there is Emma Frost was basically pushing Kitty Pryde to release Cassandra Nova from her prison, which is exactly what happened. Now again, Cassandra didn't really appear in any meaningful way following that story until you got into X-Men Red, which was a story called The Hate Machine. It's a phenomenal story, we covered it, and it basically focused on Cassandra Nova operating behind the scenes. Now something to note here is that Astonishing X-Men issue number 13 came out in 2006, but Hate Machine came out in 2018. The reason why you have this 12-year gap between essentially the escape of Cassandra Nova and her first real return in Marvel Comics is actually multifaceted. The first reason for this is that going into the early to mid 2000s under editor-in-chief Joe Quesada, Marvel was reworking and restructuring the entirety of the X-Men. You guys have all heard of the story House of M, where Scarlet Witch stripped 98% of the mutant population of their powers. In the aftermath of that, going up to the Heroic Age in 2010, Marvel was reworking everything. They were rebuilding the X-Men, they were shifting their landscape and their place in the universe around. You had Ex-Necrotia, Utopia, Messiah Complex, Messiah Wars, Second Coming. If you don't know the significance of those stories, it's not overly important. Just know that because of what was happening during that point in time, it didn't make any sense to bring Cassandra Nova back, especially considering that Xavier was powerless during most of this time. So having a guy with no powers facing off against his sister who is incredibly powerful, it's a non-starter, right? She's going to obliterate him immediately. The other reason why is looking at the Heroic Age, that's when the restructuring of the X-Men was effectively done. And that while it did present a great opportunity to bring Cassandra back, the reality is that by 2011, going into 2012, Marvel was amping up for Secret Wars. So Jonathan Hickman was writing Avengers and New Avengers, the incursions, the collapse of the multiverse. So almost as soon as they had rebuilt the X-Men, they were starting to tear them back down again. Right? So there just wasn't any real room to bring Cassandra Nova in. And so going into X-Men Red and the Hate Machine storyline, this largely focused on Jean. And Jean was a character who had really risen to prominence in a lot of ways, the same way she had done under Chris Claremont, which is to say, when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were writing her character, she was a damsel in distress. Chris Claremont gave us the Phoenix and Dark Phoenix sagas and amped her up to godhood. And while Jean Grey wasn't necessarily a godlike character here, she was the foremost telepath in the X-Men community. And so it made sense to, in turn, have Cassandra Nova show up and face off against Jean. Plus, it was the battle we never got to see. So a lot of fans were really excited to see this happen. Now, the way that Hate Machine played out was beautifully crafted, that while Cassandra Nova was involved, we didn't find out until much later on towards the end of the story. Instead, what ended up happening is you started seeing all these instances where the world just started turning against mutants arbitrarily, right? Hate crime skyrocketed, and there was no discernible reason behind it. Not only this, a senator was killed publicly in front of the world, and Jean Grey was blamed for this. So again, it wasn't just humans going into murderous rages, it was just kind of this multifaceted attack, which was far more complex than what we saw in E is for Extinction. Now, where a lot of these attacks against mutants were done by way of hypnotic suggestion, what Cassandra Nova eventually did is she took control of the mutant Forge. And most of you guys are aware of him if for no other reason than X-Men the Animated Series or X-Men 97, but Forge's mutant power is that it basically turns him into Tony Stark. And so what Cassandra Nova did is she forced him to develop what were called Sentinites, basically these microscopic nanite machines that would enter into human minds and then in turn allow them to detect if any mutant was around them and then flip out because of it, basically hijacking their brains. And so that's why anytime any mutant went anywhere, that crime skyrocketed worse than it had before, because now they were essentially mind controlled by way of machines. And so when Cassandra Nova officially made her presence known to Jean Grey, what was interesting is that Jean had actually figured it out already, and she realized that Cassandra Nova was really the only person that would be audacious enough to pull off a plan like this. More so than that, Cassandra Nova's very psychic presence was just sensed by Jean, right? So it all kind of amounted to the same thing. But what you got at the end of X-Men Red was not simply just the X-Men facing off against Cassandra Nova, it was actually a coming together of the X-Men and the Avengers, and that Tony Stark had used his technology to build a series of replicas of Magneto's helmet, which was cool to see all these different members of the superhero community who all had their own Magneto helmets units charging towards Cassandra Nova. Now, Cassandra had also built her own army using a combination of humans and anybody else that she was able to control, and ultimately it all came to a head with Cassandra Nova being defeated. But it wasn't just some traditional, like, we beat Cassandra Nova to a pulp or shut her mind down or anything along those lines. Instead, in X-Men Red issue number 11, Cassandra Nova's Sentinite in her head was manipulated by Jean to force Cassandra to feel empathy, which is something she had never felt before. And she was literally overcome with grief by the things that she had done. And so while Cassandra Nova did reappear in the Marauders series as part of Jonathan Hickman's revitalization of the X-Men line, the huge relaunch from House and Powers of 10, the reality is that it wasn't until 2023 under Steve Orlando and the Here Comes Yesterday storyline that you actually get, at least as far as we know now, the kind of conclusion to Cassandra Nova. And it's particularly interesting because she wasn't really a villain in the traditional sense, not in the way she had been. Instead, the conclusion to her character really just came by way of vengeance from Kitty Pryde and the other members of the Marauders who never forgave her for the actions in Genosha. And so what Steve Orlando did is he introduced this civilization called the Threshold, and this group was under the control of two beings called Archaea and Sublime. Now, to sidetrack here for a second, I want to talk about these two because they're kind of important for this story, but they're also really, really interesting. So to step away from Cassandra Nova for a second, billions and billions of years ago in the early days of life on Earth, Sublime was introduced as this bacterial entity that had the ability to jump from one host body to the next, effectively granting it the ability to control the world. When mutants started popping up on the scene, Sublime realized it couldn't control mutants. And so when Grant Morrison and Frank Quietly introduced their run on New X-Men, we actually learned that the entire basis behind Weapons Plus, so Captain America running all the way up to Wolverine, Deadpool, those guys, was launched by John Sublime as a way to create super soldiers to contain, control, and even destroy the mutant population. Now, of course, a lot of that had been done away with over the years, especially when it came to like the Wolverine origin storyline by Daniel Way. But focusing back on Cassandra Nova, as part of the Steve Orlando run in Marauders, Kitty Pryde and other members of the Marauders alongside Cassandra had gone back into the past. And the idea was to basically use the kind of spiritual essences of all those mutants who had been killed on Genosha to effectively deposit them in the past and create a new mutant civilization. That was Threshold. Now, Threshold was split into two parts. One part was human, one part was mutant. It doesn't really quite line up with the history of Marvel Comics and how long this will last as far as Marvel's recognition of it being an absolute part of Earth's history with regards to the mutants. Only time will tell. But the bigger point is that while Cassandra Nova did use her powers to essentially liberate Threshold from Sublime and Archaea, the bigger thing is that she was attacked by the Marauders and stranded in the past because, again, they never forgave her for her actions in Genosha. Now, what will happen with Cassandra? We don't fully know. Again, this story came out last year, so it could very well be that Cassandra won't show up for any meaningful time. As far as I'm aware, she's not back yet, but given the fact that she's a major player in Deadpool and Wolverine, Marvel will likely bring her back in some capacity. What that'll be is only anybody's guess. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Again, that's the long and short of Cassandra in Marvel Comics. She's wildly powerful, started off as a villain, became a hero, and then was stranded in the past for her efforts. But let me know if there's any other characters you guys want me to see down in the comments section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.